I'll try to make the economic case for development that is led by increasing equality and increasing public investment. So it is a business case for equality, although, of course, I share the importance of the social and moral case for equality. But the case I'm trying to make to policymakers as well as to businesses, if you want a strong and stable economy, you need equality and public investment. Otherwise, you end up with a weak and wobbly economy in which you end up with a coalition of chaos in government. All these references, if you had followed the British elections recently, of course, is referring to the conservative theory of a strong and stable economy led by rising inequality and austerity. In our cases, well, this is actually very weak and wobbly. And sadly, the drama that we're experiencing with poor people killed in a fire just because they were poor, which was very eloquently explained by my colleague Rory before, who explained the housing crisis, is exactly showing us how fragile this foundation is. Now, I will try to walk you through some of the really technical work we have done for a project together with FEPS, TASC, and ECLM, and Greenwich Political Economy Research Center at the University of Greenwich. So that builds on co-authored work with my colleagues at Greenwich, Daniele Torri, as well as Thomas Obst and Maria Nicolaidi and myself. And thanks to Paul Sweeney for being with us when we launched these results a month ago in Greenwich, and thanks for encouraging you to read. I have to say the policy reports are very non-technical. They are available on the desk outside. There are also technical reports, which I find very important because indeed there is a technical and rigorous, quite robust case to make for the need for higher equality and public investment if you want a strong and stable economy. Now, I'll start with the big picture. The big picture for me is to start with the needs of our society. What do we want to achieve? Surely things like budget deficit, which is attracting over attention by our governments, is not the aim of economic policy making. For me, the key challenges of economic policy in the 21st century is to be able to achieve full employment with decent jobs, with equality for both men and women, and at the same time achieving ecological sustainability. I'll be talking, of course, a lot about growth, but the kind of growth I wish to achieve is the one that hits these three targets at the same time, and none of them can be sacrificed at the expense of another, in my opinion. So we are having a multiple crises in terms of all these three targets. If we want to hit these targets, we need a full mix, a comprehensive mix of all the policies we have in our toolkit as policymakers. It does require full use of fiscal policy and monetary policy, not just monetary policy, hence. And in terms of fiscal policy, it does require a full-blown public investment program, and not just in physical infrastructure, as is usually accepted, but also in social infrastructure, which has been also emphasized in James' talk before. With social infrastructure, we mean infrastructure of health, social care, education, and childcare. Education including childcare, if you like. We need industrial policy to serve these needs, and we need labor market policy, not just redistributive policies, but labor market policies to deal with the inequality at the marketplace in terms of tackling inequality. Now, why does that all matter, or what are some of the barriers in achieving these targets? The one target we are spotting in our research is the broken link between profitability and private investment in the past 3.5 decades in every single country of Europe. This is related to financialization on the one hand, and it is related to inequality on the other hand, but also it's related to the lack of or a deteriorating public infrastructure basis. Obviously, if you don't have enough private investment, no wonder you're not going to get also enough productivity. Most of the mainstream policymaking is preoccupied by the stagnation in productivity without seeing the core reasons behind it related to rising inequality and financialization. Let me first talk about the financialization aspect. So what we have seen in the past 3.5 decades is, on the one hand, rising profits, but on the other hand, falling private investment or stagnation in private investment. Surely a fall in the ratio of private investment in physical machinery and equipment is a ratio to increasing profits. So the UK is one of the bottom cases in G7 in that respect, but the problem is a shared problem across the world. Indeed, across the developed world in particular, but also in some developing parts of the world. What we have looked in the project we did together was to look at the behavior of non-financial corporations and their financial activities. As they cut their investment in their core activities, there was a surge in their financial activities. And that explains quite a big chunk of the stagnation in private investment in physical machinery and equipment. Firms simply have directed their profits to speculation, to financial speculation. There's been a rise in, on the one hand, interest payments in the earlier stage, and then with the fall in interest rates, a big surge in dividends paid to the shareholders. But there has been also a rise in their financial revenues as opposed to revenues coming from their core businesses. Both of them have contributed to the suppression of private investment, not just the leakage towards the shareholder, but also their redirection towards financial speculation. So-called financial investments have contributed to the decline. So what we find in Europe, in the non-financial corporations, using individual firm-level data and their balance sheets, is that investment in Europe on average would have been about 27% higher without the surge in financialization in terms of satisfaction of the shareholder value orientation through rising dividend payments and rising interest payments. And again, investment would have been another 10% higher without the surge in financial speculation and increasing financial revenues of the non-financial corporations. Interestingly, those financial revenues are not providing more income for financing the investments of non-financial corporations. It's just fueling this vicious circle of financial speculation further. The results are very similar in Ireland to the average of the European country. There is a little bit more difference in Ireland between the large versus the smaller companies, but we have to say that the large non-financial corporations are those that make, of course, the bulk of the investment. And the Irish large non-financial corporations, investment rate, again, would have been 14% higher without this surge in financial payments in the form of dividends or interest. There is no effect that we find from financial incomes for the large companies, but if you look at small companies, there's in their case we find some positive effect of those financial incomes, but as I said, not in the large companies. Now, the second dimension of this broken link between private investment and private profits is the channel that goes through demand. This is a macroeconomic environment. Now, the surge in private profitability, as I said earlier, hasn't led to higher private investment simply because investment isn't just about profitability. It is as much or even more so about the demand for the goods and services the firms are producing. Now, what happened with rising inequality in Europe was a stagnation in aggregate demand, because obviously simply the impact of lower wages, stagnating wages, lower purchasing power of households is a big negative impact for consumption of domestic households. So private investors are looking at that stagnant or falling domestic consumption of the households, or domestic consumption fueled by increasing debt on fragile, wobbly and weak foundations, if you like. And it's creating a certain uncertainty if you want to engage in long-term irreversible investment. So it's no wonder they're resorting towards financial speculation, which is very, of course, short-termist, but a lot more reversible and in that sense a lot less risky. So what we find is higher profits actually isn't leading private investment, not in Ireland, not in other European countries, in the other piece we have done for this project. So this mix of financialization and inequality is leading to low private investment, no wonder low productivity, and it is leading to, coming from the demand side, from high inequality, deficient demand, a bottleneck also on the supply side, limiting the potential growth of our countries. So no wonder we have stagnation in productivity. In Britain, people kept talking about a productivity puzzle. I see no puzzle there. It's perfectly clear. Continuation of these policies will, of course, lead to stagnant productivity. Now, we try to put on our full optimism, and when we were doing this research in 2016, there was very little reason to be optimistic in the UK. Today, I'm a lot more optimistic because some of these things we are saying did make its way to the manifesto of the official opposition party of the UK, and it won support of the people. So we are talking about some very common sense, some very actually modest starting point policies here. What I'll try to summarize you is trying to quantify a little bit these nice words about increasing equality and increasing public spending. So we're talking about 3 pillars of policy here. Let's increase public spending with a very modest amount of 1 percentage point of GDP a year. Let's reverse the rising inequality and falling share of labor income, wage income in national income by, again, a very small amount of 1 percentage point every year. Mind you, wage share in Europe has fallen by about 10 percentage point as a ratio of national income in the past 3 decades. So this is a very modest step every year that we propose taking. And the third pillar is about redistribution. It's about making the taxation system more progressive in the sense of increasing taxes on capital and reducing taxes on labor by each 1 percentage point again. Now, we try to look at the impact of this on each country in the European Union and also in Britain, which is still part of the European Union. So in our simulations, it's part of the EU 15 simulations. So we look at the impact in each country in isolation, if they're the only ones doing it with no one else following suit. And we also then say what happens if the European Commission really uses its influence and powers and coordinates this policy across each country in Europe. Now, the results are very clear. Egalitarian policies, increasing the wage share through a range of pre-distributive policies, through a range of labor market policies, do create more demand and more growth. That's the good news. The impact of, however, increasing equality on growth is very modest. It's small. It's not an impediment to growth. That's the good news. So what the European Commission tells us is wrong. What they advocate is wage moderation. What they advocate is wages should increase less than productivity every year in every country in Europe. What we say is wages should exceed the rise in productivity for a while until we reverse that inequality of the last 3 decades. And if you do that, you can grow, as opposed to what the European Commission has been imposing in Europe at the moment. So with that, though, you don't hit your targets about creating full employment and creating ecological sustainability. You need to do something else, which is very important. This is about public investment. The overall stimulus, the impact of this policy mix is becoming very strong if you mix policies to increase the wage share with public investment policies. And of course, the effects are tremendously stronger if you do it simultaneously at each country, if you coordinate policies. Now, my take on this is we've been able to coordinate the bad policies for decades in Europe. Yes, we can. Yes, we can now coordinate the good policies. Now, if you do that, what we are getting is, if you coordinate both wage and fiscal policies in Europe, what we're getting is a tremendous, in 1 year, 6.7% higher GDP in Europe. In Ireland, the impact is very strong. It's about 3%. Of course, being a small, very open economy, there is some import leakages in Ireland, in small economies. So obviously one needs to think a little bit more tilted, differentiated policies here, but 3% more GDP in Ireland is very good. Now, everybody asks me about what happens to private investment. Surely that will shy away private investment. You are increasing taxes on corporate profits and you're increasing public spending. That will surely crowd out private investment. No, this is wrong macroeconomics. We have to have the confidence to say that if you mix the right kind of policies, private entrepreneurs aren't stupid. They look at the business environment, the improvement in infrastructure coming from public investment. They look at the improvement in confidence of households fueled by not a shaky debt-led growth, but a robust, rigorous, productivity-driven wage growth. So in our estimations, econometric work, as an outcome of this three-way policy mix, private investment increases in Europe and also in Ireland. In Ireland, the increase is about by 1.4% of GDP in terms of private investment. Public spending is actually crowding in private investment. It's not crowding out. This is despite the fact that we do allow for public investment to lead to some rise in public debt, which does translate into potential changes in interest rate. We do accommodate such potential negative crowding out effects of public spending, but they are dwarfed by the rise in demand and the business environment, improved business environment. Now, again, I'm always asked by policymakers, but what will be the effect of that on our budget balance? Surely it will deteriorate and that will lead to capital outflows. That's the biggest threat for policymakers. Well, we crunched the numbers. This policy mix, if you increase public spending, mixed with a healthy growth fueled by rising wages, and if you do your job also in terms of the correct type of increasing taxation, targeting the high profits as opposed to labor income, you are able to improve even your budget balance. What we found in Europe overall was this policy mix is leading to an improvement in budget balance by about 0.9%. You could say that there is a margin of error around it, and we could say, to be very cautious, conservative, this policy mix is budget neutral. It's not going to add to budget deficit. In Ireland, the impact is very much close to 0.05%, if you want me to be very precise. But I would say with confidence, this policy mix of redistributive progressive taxation, public spending, and egalitarian labor market policies doesn't hurt budget balance. And by trade unionism, I'm always asked about the inflationary effect of rising wages. We again looked at the effect. If you do, as we say, increase the wage share by 1 percentage point, which means real wages will increase 1 percentage point quicker, faster than the rise in productivity, that will lead to some rise in prices. How much? In 1 year, by 1.5%. What is the inflation target of the European Central Bank, ECB? 2%. Our advice to ECB, if you want to beat deflation, which is the bigger threat in Europe after the Great Recession, you need to do, as we say, you need to go for a wage-led growth policy. In Ireland, the inflationary effect of this rise in the wage share by 1 percentage point is actually ignorable. It will increase prices, other things being constant, by only 0.9%. So what are the key policy lessons for me? Again, if I may recap, what we need is high investment. That requires re-establishing the broken link between investment and profits, which in turn requires a very systematic public intervention. The state needs to lead the way by public investment in key sectors and infrastructure. And the key sectors here would, of course, include housing, and the infrastructure includes not just physical infrastructure of transport, but also it includes social infrastructure of health and social care, education and childcare. It does require thinking about corporate governance to make sure that we create the correct incentives for private businesses, to encourage long-term patient investment as opposed to short-termist speculative investment. And it requires reinstating this broken link between private investment and private profits. That does, of course, require talking about financialization, in return talk about regulating finance. It does, most of all, require, however, talking about inequality and the correct labor market policies for achieving a wage-led growth to achieve sustainable, strong, stable demand as opposed to weak, wobbly, and fragile debt-led demand. I so like the weak and wobbly. I'm sorry if I'm repeating, but our current Prime Minister kept repeating strong and stable. That cost her, of course, her majority. So I can't repeat the weak and wobbly part of the current conservative policies enough, I'm afraid. Okay, so just to finish on the labor market policies aspect, because my co-panelists will, of course, go into much more detail in that respect. I speak of a wage-led development strategy using labor market policies. How do we do that? How can we achieve this miraculous rise in the wage share by 1 percentage point? Well, we know the policies. It's not rocket science. It's about policies to intervene in the labor market, targeting inequality at the top, targeting distribution in the middle, wages in the middle of the wage distribution, as well as targeting the bottom of the wage distribution. And it requires remembering the importance of the role of the state in institution building. So I'll talk only about the pre-distributive policies in my last remaining 3 minutes. The most crucial part of the policy intervention for me is really talking about the middle, which has lost incredible ground. And these are sometimes seen as the privileged unionized workers, public sector workers with gold-plated pensions, which are, of course, far from reality. But what is important for me to recognize the change in collective bargaining institutions and to reverse them. The key point here is we will not be able to tackle inequality if we don't increase the bargaining power of labor. Inequality is as much about the erosion in union power as it is about globalization in the form of offshoring, migration, or in the form of technological change. A more important part of that is about the bargaining relations between labor versus capital that requires re-regulating the labor market, of course, ending zero-hours contracts. It requires improving the union legislation and building institutions to increase the coverage of collective bargaining. But it also requires thinking of legislation to time one of the biggest causes of rising inequality, the gender wage gaps that have been persisting. There's been some decline in gender wage gaps through a downward convergence after the crisis. We have to reverse that. We have to think of an upward convergence in terms of closing gender wage gaps that gets us a long way in terms of achieving a rise in the wage share as well. At the bottom of the distribution, of course, again, the key policy tool, one of the most important policies we have, is to achieve a decent minimum wage that is worthy of the word living wage. And at the bottom, we need to talk about regulating high pay. And this is, again, not rocket science. It's about enforcing pay ratios between the high executive pay versus the low pay in the corporations. Redistributive policies are, of course, particularly in terms of targeting the the top of inequality, are as important. This is why in our proposal we were thinking of increasing the tax rate on capital income while decreasing the tax rates on labor income. Obviously, in a more nuanced formulation that is focusing on redistribution, one needs to talk about progressivity of income taxation of wage income as well is, of course, wealth taxation. But this is not part of the area that I will have much time to dwell in, so I'll leave that for the discussion. Thank you very much.